Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. It's a great pleasure today to be joined by Dr. Dan Diker from the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs. Dan, very good to have you here with me today.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Great to be with you.
So we were speaking earlier about how Hamas has gained international legitimacy since October 7th in a way that they never had prior to this. Are you able to, before we really delve deep into this and its implications for Israel, can you just share with our viewers what that means? What countries are recognizing the PA or Hamas in a way which they had not prior to this war?
Moshe, one of the most troubling aspects of the Hamas mass murder backed by the Iranian regime on October the 7th and the subsequent Hamas-Israel war in Gaza and beyond is the upgrade in international legitimacy that the Hamas has enjoyed since the massacre, one of the worst massacre against civilians in a one-day period in decades, very much arguably since the Nazi period. And what is most troubling is that this was a perfect jihadi storm that on the face of it should have convinced the free world, beginning with the United States, that they really understood the overall Palestinian national and Islamic movement's ultimate goal, which was for decades since the PLO covenant in 1964, and then again the updated one in 1968, which was to destroy the nation state of the Jewish people. And then 40 years later, in 1988, the Hamas covenant, which called for the mass murder of Jews and the destruction of Israel. We would have thought that the October 7th capstone to that jihadi commitment, both from the PLO and from Hamas, would have been enough to convince the free world what we were dealing with here on October 7th. But what happened? The exact opposite happened. And here we have a situation, Moshe, in which Hamas is now prosecuting an international diplomatic jihad, having been upgraded as what can be argued a pre-state type of legitimacy that the Palestinian Authority has in the international community. Now we have a situation in which Hamas, which according to Dr. Shkaki's own Palestinian polls, has commanded up to 80% of the Palestinian public in what they know as the former West Bank of Jordan, what we know in the state of Israel is called Judea and Samaria, under PA control, as well as the majority of the Gaza public backs Hamas as the legitimate leader of the Palestinian street in all of their in all the areas under their control, and they're in fact competing with the Palestinian Authority Fatah-led leadership in Ramallah. Now, what we're seeing as we conduct this discussion is that the International Criminal Court, for the first time in its history, has issued an order for the chief prosecutor of the ICC has issued arrest orders for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Yahya Sinwar, the Iranian-backed terror leader of the Hamas. This type of moral equivalence is so sick. I mean, there's no other way of describing it, and disfigured, but it reflects an extraordinary development in which the Hamas has essentially gained in legitimacy to a free democratic nation state in the UN system. So that has triggered this, not only this ICC arrest warrant request, it triggered the ICJ investigation against Israel on charges of genocide. It has triggered UN statements and declarations condemning Israel for crimes against humanity and genocide. It has also triggered, and with this I'll end with my initial observations, the recognition by several European states of a Palestinian state. Namely, we already know that Ireland, Norway, and Spain have already agreed to recognize a Palestinian state. And that comes on the heels of this mass murder on October 7th. So you put all these developments together, and you must infer that this is a successful diplomatic jihad against the state of Israel.
Let me ask you, I mean, is Hamas and the PA, are they behind this, what you call diplomatic jihad? Uh, I guess, well-versed enough in public diplomacy to pull this off? Or are there other actors in the international field who are kind of swooping in and creating this opportunity for them?
That's a very good question. If we take a look at the Hamas, we see an organization that is very sophisticated, an organization that for several decades have been laying seeds in the West, in the university space, particularly with regard to the Hamas political refugees that were unindicted following the very famous 2001 Holy Land terror financing case, which was a terror financing case that raised $12 million, was finally broken up by the Department of the Treasury of the United States, and it was meant for Hamas in Gaza. That terror financing case was exposed. There were a number of Hamas operatives and NGO operatives that went to jail, but there were those that did not go to jail and remained unindicted. They formed several NGOs that were pro-Hamas NGOs, meaning they were Hamas-affiliated NGOs, one called Kind Hearts, another called the Islamic Association for Palestine, IAP, and another one called AMP, American Muslims for Palestine. The American Muslims for Palestine became the funnel and remain a funnel for the financing of Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the responsible organization with 300 branches across the United States in major universities across the United States for funding this Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a Hamas supporting and even affiliated cheerleader across these universities. So it really shows us that Hamas has had a very, very deep and broad reach into the American civil society, into academia across American cities, using other NGOs as funnels to fund these organizations and really subvert campus life across the United States. Hamas has got its fingerprints all over this.
What I'm hearing from you is that anti-Semitism is a lucrative business. How do you fight against this when by spewing hatred, they grow?
Well, first, we have to identify that this is anti-Semitism, because there are many of those, including, unfortunately, and I say it with the greatest of regrets, there are radical organizations in the Jewish community in North America, such as If Not Now, such as what they call the Jewish Voice for Peace. These are organizations that deny, reject, and actively oppose the existence of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, and they work towards Israel's dissolution. This is also anti-Semitism, and it is a version of anti-Semitism that is that has mutated from the religious and the national mutations or versions of anti-Semitism, beginning 2,000 years ago with the false accusation, that the Jews killed Jesus. That became the religious version of anti-Semitism, and then moving into the 18th and 19th century, there was a racial type of anti-Semitism. Now we have a sort of a political mutation of anti-Semitism targeting sovereign Jews, but also spilling over into violence and anti-Semitism against non-sovereign Jews, as we've seen all over Europe, all over the free world, in the United States as well. And so, yes, this is very much anti-Semitism, and it is a type of Jew hatred that is particularly difficult, because there are those that will say, hey, Moshe, hey, Dan, this is not anti-Semitism. This is called legitimate political criticism of Israel. Well, defining Israel as a genocidal war criminal is not criticism of Israel. it is in fact part of the call for holy war, which casts the Jews as as criminals, as infidels that have to be eliminated, which really brings us finally to the closing of a circle between what some people call Islamo-fascist, which is sort of fascist type of Islamism that really reminds us of the fascism that we experienced and that claimed over 6 million Jewish lives in the Nazi period, in the Nazi Holocaust of the Second World War. So really coming full circle now. In 2024, George Orwell wrote a book called 1984, and here we are 50 years later. We're really living it.
Dan, I think all of our viewers,
40 years later, not 50 years later, 40 years later.
I think all of our viewers are certainly in tune with what you're saying, that this is a war of anti-Semitism and not just a territorial dispute. But if you were put, front and center and in front of some of these naive college kids in the States who really don't have a background in what's happening in Israel or Jewish history, how would you very succinctly explain that the Hamas attack in Israel was not an attack over territory, but it was an attack against Jews?
Well, clearly that is the key question, because there is a gulf of misunderstanding and conceptual difference between the discourse in the United States, which is a discourse that is rooted in their understanding, or I would argue misunderstanding, that we are merely in the midst, or maybe at the apex of what they know is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that began, as the narrative goes, 100 years ago, even well before the establishment of the State of Israel. Others saying, it began with the Arab states attacking Israel on its founding, May 14th, 1948, then subject to some sort of diplomatic process based on land for peace. That is the narrative that defines the discourse in the United States, even regarding the October 7th massacres. Meaning that in the university spaces and in the civil discourse in the United States, they see the mass murder of October 7th carried out by Hamas and Fatah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the subsequent war that we continue to fight in Gaza against the Hamas. They see that as a continuation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is false. It is untrue. It is completely disingenuous and fallacious. What we are facing today, Moshe, which we have to explain to our brothers and sisters and friends and colleagues across the Atlantic in the United States, is that we continue to face today a religious ideological rejection of any Jewish sovereign presence in the Middle East, period. That was defined already 100 years ago, almost exactly, by none other than Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was considered a sort of religio-political leader of, in Jerusalem. And he called for a jihad against the Jews and already said, Al-Aqsa is in danger, meaning the Al-Aqsa Mosque was in danger because Jews wanted to pray there. He determined that it was a religious ideological conflict, as well as advancing that ideological conflict through the Muslim Brotherhood that was established in 1928. We're almost there. And the Muslim Brotherhood, remember, were allied with the ideas of the Nazi Party that got going in the 1930s and that were advanced by Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb. They became the predecessors of whom? Al-Qaeda. So here we have a very clear indication of the genesis of this conflict. It was not a conflict. It's a religious erasure by Muslim Brotherhood, jihadi elements beginning 100 years ago and continuing. The Hamas is the continuation of the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's very clear, I think, today in Israel, especially after October 7th, and what they call the Al-Aqsa flood, the Hamas calls the Al-Aqsa flood, using the nomenclature and imagery of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is exactly the imagery and nomenclature that was used by Haj Amin al-Husseini 100 years ago, that we are still being victimized by a jihad. And that's how we started our program, because they've taken it to diplomatic circles and convinced the free world and the United Nations that they are the victims and we are the villains, when they establish themselves as the jihadists to destroy the dhimmi Jews from having any kind of sovereign presence here 100 years ago. So that's our challenge today, Moshe, is to close the gap between the understanding in America that we are continuing a territorial conflict, when in fact, empirically, it is proven that we are today continuing to be assaulted by an ideological religious war against the Jews.
Do you think that before October 7th, you would hear this framing of the war in Israel, that it's not about land, but it's about ideology, it's about jihad, it's about religion? Or is this something that Israeli thinkers, Israeli military leaders are only starting to come to terms with post-October 7th?
The October 7th atrocities were a represented a watershed moment for making that conceptual shift from a debate that many in the West were somewhat unaware of, that has been taking place in Israel over the last decades, and particularly since Israel legitimized and partnered with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that was born out of a jihadist, frankly, rejection. Even though the Fatah, which was considered, a non-Islamic, more nationalist faction of the PLO, they actually called in 1964 for the jihad against the Jews. So the debate in Israel the domestic debate in Israel has also contained this sort of territorial element as to what the defensible borders in Israel could be, as to how Israel should best protect itself, but not dominate a growing population of Arabs in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. So the last 4 wars with the Hamas, and remember, the Hamas attacked us in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2018, and then again in 2021, we had guardians of the walls. So we've had 4 or 5 major small wars, military operations against the Hamas. The Hamas's motivation had always been the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They had always used. Remember the Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2000. We had that war as well. So from their point of view, it's always been religiously motivated. From an Israeli point of view, there has been an outstanding debate about whether this was just, the apex of, or the most severe expression of this ongoing territorial conflict. I think as October the 7th, Israelis understand that something far different has taken place here than just the continuation of a territorial conflict. But this is one of the reasons why, and I'd like our friends from across the seas in the United States and Canada, in the West, in the free world, to understand, and the free world, meaning Australia and the UK, New Zealand and South Africa, to understand that it was Israel itself that had demanded of itself a territorial compromise, is what actually legitimized the Hamas and the PLO and the PA today, as we're having this conversation, which is what triggered increased international legitimacy of the Palestinian crusade for statehood in the United Nations General Assembly, as we saw recently. The PA has Mahmoud Abbas, at 87 years old, or 88, has appealed to the GA to increase or improve the pathway towards total acceptance. He is now in total competition with the Hamas in order to control the Palestinian street and win greater international legitimacy. So Israel's own readiness over the years to compromise with the PLO has actually boomeranged against Israel and has climaxed in this, October 7th bloody massacre that the world is still understanding as part of the larger territorial conflict. If I hope I've been clear enough and to try to draw these distinctions.
For sure. So basically, at some point between 1948 and 1967, Israel was really perpetuating this false narrative that it's all about land and borders. And now we've woken up and understood it's much bigger than that. So how do we walk back decades and decades of not framing the war properly? What is the next step for Israel?
The next step is called expose, educate, and engage. Expose our enemy every single day. We are living in an iPhone war. This is iPhone warfare or Android warfare. And it means that we can mobilize 6.5 billion people instantaneously through Android and iPhone. That is exactly what the Hamas is doing. That's what the Iranian regime is doing. That's what the PLO has done. That's what the Fatah has done. That's what the PA is doing. They have recast us, the Jews, as the ultimate evil, which brings us back to the original anti-Semitism of 3,000 years ago. And we have got to expose our adversaries with the same assertiveness that they are, trying to cast us as, genocidal, war criminal, apartheid, racist entity, as all we all know the adjectives that our enemies have used. We must do exactly the same thing and expose the Hamas for what they are, which is clearly an ISIS genocidal organization that mass rapes, brutalizes, tortures, and murders women all at the same time, and children. Had we done that, Moshe, from October the 7th, and even before in these former wars, we would be reminding the world who Hamas really is. They murder their own people. They starve their own people. They brutalize their own people. They violate human rights against their own people. Why have we failed to do that day in and day out for the last decades? And certainly since October the 7th, the worst one-day atrocity against Jews in the land of Israel since the Second Temple period. And we needed and need today to publicize these horrible videos that come out against the brutalization of our women and our children. They must be shown every single day, even if it's for 2 minutes and 3 minutes on all the social networks in multiple languages, as to this is who Hamas is, because the world forgot who Hamas is. And they've recast Israel as Hamas, and they've recast Hamas as Israel. This is this inversion of legitimacy that George Orwell reminded us about back in his book 1984. And here we are living that type of Orwellian Kafkaesque horror, and we can reverse it by exposing our enemy every moment. Question: why? I saw Minister Ron Dermer give an extraordinary interview and on Sky News, in which he's arguing, rightfully so, that there are thousands of tons of food that are flooding into Gaza. The Hamas is stealing it for its own purposes. It's very easy to prove it. We just have to be exposing exactly what is happening in Gaza every single day. There's no doubt we can win the war, but we have to expose, educate, meaning we have to really educate people as to who our enemies really are. People don't know that the PLO and the Hamas are really not that different ideologically one from the other, especially with their ultimate meta goal of destroying Israel and eliminating the world of sovereign Jews. And number three, we have to engage the world very actively. We have to engage them diplomatically. We have to engage them in civil society fora. We have to engage them in as well as in our communication networks, as well as major media. So that's the way we win. We have to go on the offense 24/7. There is no way that Israel should be in a position of defending itself anymore. We are facing a bitter enemy that has successfully mobilized international institutions, international public opinion, and we are behind in that international diplomatic jihad.
It seems like there was a strategic decision, or maybe a decision born out of sensitivity, not to publish some of the really horrible images of October 7th. I mean, do you think that was a mistake, that the IDF or the government should now be sharing some of that really graphic material to get the message across?
Traditionally, Israel preferred to avoid that, those types of really graphic revelations out of respect for the families, and because also it was considered to be very terror-like influence and perception operations, if you will, almost beneath the collective honor of a thriving, democratic, free society to use those types of tactics and strategies. But we see the result of failing to do that, as long as the families agree that we can publish some of these very, very difficult images and describe exactly the nature of this sick and evil organization called ISIS Hamas. It is absolutely come time that we fight fire with fire. This is an existential war. This is a war of pikuach nefesh. This is not a war of choice. This is a war of necessity. And we know from our holy tradition in the Talmud Torah that in such a situation we have got to use all of the instruments at our in our toolkit, if you will, in our satchel, in order to defend ourselves and also to destroy our enemies. And we are clearly in an existential moment, not only on the military terror battlefield, but on the battlefield of perception. The battlefield of perception. The old traditional concept of what we call in Hebrew hasbara, which means explaining ourselves, explaining our policies, has now morphed into a new concept called toda'ah, or perception and influence. That's the war that we're in. And the way you win a war of toda'ah, of perception, is by exposing your enemies and in influencing the audience that is represented by or influenced by your enemy. And we have clearly got to be there now, because the other way has failed us and has compromised Israel and the Jewish people's international profile and standing and legitimacy. And I think that the international criminal courts twisted, disfigured, and completely amoral call to arrest the prime minister of one of the most outstanding free democratic countries in the world, Benjamin Netanyahu, is a wake-up call as to how low the world can sink at the behest of an ISIS jihadi terror organization called Hamas.
Dan, I very much appreciate your time, and every time we speak, I learn so much from you. I want to ask one final question. We have a minute left.
Sure.
I asked many of my guests when they come on the briefing to tell me if they think that Israel can win this war and destroy Hamas, as was one of the stated goals of this war. But I want to ask the question differently to you, because you're saying this is not just a war against Hamas, this is a war against anti-Semitism. So my question to you, 1 minute or less, can the Jewish people win a war against anti-Semitism?
Israel can win small wars, small battles against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a disease, and it's a disease that can be placed into remission. But it really requires us to use the correct medicine in order to put anti-Semitism into remission. I think the larger question is to point out to the world, this is a war against the civilized world. It's a war against the West. And it's also a war against the more amenable Middle East, a Middle East that's amenable to the West. So yes, we can win the war. I'll just finally say that the United States successfully neutralized Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The ideology didn't disappear, but the operationalization of the ideology was neutralized in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and the United States, the Western Alliance, proved that's possible. When you rob those enemies of a territorial base, you rob the effectiveness of these jihadi death cult ideologies from being operationalized.
Dr. Van Dyker from the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Israel time. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.